Hey guys, welcome back to another video, and in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the state of the race of the 2024 presidential election between incumbent President Joe Biden, who will be facing off the former President Donald Trump in the rematch, and we also have Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as an independent candidate who can also be a spoiler. We're going to be taking a look at the latest and newest polling data, polling averages from just the month of April alone to see where all these swing states stand and who is favored at this point in time to win the election. But before we get started, make sure you are subscribed and click the bell so you get notified whenever I upload a video instead of missing out on any of them. And also, we have memberships, so if you're looking for that, it's pinned in the comment section down below. Let's start off with some of these swing states. So as of today, Trump has a 10-point lead in Iowa and an 11-point lead in Ohio. So anything above 10% is considered safe, in my opinion. Those states have just shifted too far to the right for it to be even somewhat close, somewhat competitive. It's just out of reach for any Democrat, not just Biden in general. And Trump is expected to crack double digits in both of those states. And then as well as Maine's 2nd Congressional District, Donald Trump is winning that by 7 to 10 percentage points, which is considered likely. And then in Nebraska's 2nd Congressional District, Biden wins that by a lean margin, and he won this district back in 2020. And then in Maine's at-large, Biden is actually winning it by a likely margin instead of a safe. And a lot of that have to do with RFK Jr. being on the ballot, and Maine actually loves third-party independent candidates, so RFK can actually perform well in Maine. That's probably will be his stronghold, but I'm not saying he will win a district. And now, let's begin with these polling averages. Take a look at Nevada. As of today, Donald Trump has a current lead of 3 percentage points according to majority of polling averages. That is considered a lean margin. But when you factor in other things like betting markets, for example, Biden is up by 1%, and then expert ratings has it a dead toss-up tie, 50-50 for either candidate. That's when you factor in those other things. The projected margin comes out to a total of 0.3% for Donald Trump. But in this video, we're specifically taking a look at polling averages the latest and the newest polls out of this month of April. I do this every single month. So Donald Trump is winning Nevada by a lean margin of 3 percentage points according to majority of polls. And now moving on to the state of Colorado. So as of April, Biden wins Colorado by, according to polling averages, by roughly 7.5 percentage points, which is slightly less than his 2020 margin. But when you factor in other things like betting markets, he's up by double digits, 10 points. Expert ratings has him up by almost 11%. So when you factor in all those things, he's almost up by 12%, which actually is slightly more than his 2020 margin. So overall, Biden is actually performing very well in Colorado, which is basically the opposite of the nation, in which polls suggest that Trump is doing better in every other swing state besides Colorado. Colorado is probably a Biden stronghold in this election. But take a look at polling averages alone, and just polling averages only, Biden's up by 7.5 percentage points, which is considered a likely margin, but it still doesn't matter, as he should comfortably win this state. And the next state is going to be New Mexico. President Biden, as of polling averages, is currently up by 8.5 percentage points, which is a greater margin than in Colorado, which in my opinion, I honestly think Biden's going to win Colorado by a greater margin than he would in New Mexico, but the polls are saying the exact opposite, so I'm not sure if I'm going to trust this. Projected margin comes out to almost 10% when you factor in betting markets and expert ratings. Keep in mind, Biden won the state by almost 11% back in 2020. So it's around the same margin, but it doesn't really matter. It still doesn't really matter, as Biden is expected to win New Mexico by a likely margin pretty comfortably, and it won't get that competitive just like Colorado. I think Colorado and New Mexico will probably be around the same thing, but I think New Mexico would be slightly more competitive than Colorado would be. But at this point in time, the polls are saying the exact opposite, that Colorado would actually be more competitive, which I would disagree. And now, moving on to the Sunbelt state of Texas. Donald Trump, according to majority of polling averages, is up by 8 percentage points, and when you factor in betting markets, he's up by 8.5%. He expands his lead. And then extra ratings, it actually gets narrower, but he's still up significantly by a likely margin of 7.5 percentage points. So the projected margin comes to a total of 6.3%, which would be considered lean. But we're taking a look at polling averages alone. He's up by 8%, likely margin comfortable. It's actually more than his 2020 and 2016 margin in this state specifically. And this is a state that Democrats hoped they would perform very well in 2020. And some actually may thought that they would flip the state from red to blue. And then the 2022 midterm midterms, in the governor's race, they thought they could defeat Greg Abbott by running Beto O'Rourke, which performed very well in the 2018 Senate race against Ted Cruz. That ended up exploding in the Democrats' faces, and Texas heavily supported Greg Abbott in favor of Republicans. So this state is actually a lot more red than you may think, but Hispanics in this state usually lean Democrat 2/3 of the vote, basically roughly 60%, but they're actually more conservative than what some people may think. So with that being said, Texas is still a very red state, and Donald Trump at this point in time is performing very well among Latinos, and he's actually pretty much tied with Biden at the moment among that type of group. Talking aside, Trump wins Texas by a comfortable, likely margin in this year's election cycle. And now moving on to the state of Florida. Donald Trump is not quite cracking double digits in this state. Meanwhile, he should flip Miami-Dade County, in which Ron DeSantis performed very well in back in the 2022 midterms. Polling averages has Donald Trump at 8.7%, so almost 9%. But betting markets, you factor in that, it's still 8.5 percentage points. And then expert ratings, he's up by 7.3%. So when you average all of those out, all those factors, it comes to a total projected margin of 7 percentage points. So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter wherever you take a look at betting markets, expert ratings, or polling averages, all suggest pretty consistently that Trump is up by a likely margin, in which back in 2020 he won it by a lean margin. So obviously this state is shifting towards the right in favor of Republicans, and basically statewide they just abandoned the Democratic Party. The state is soon to be a safe Republican state, and if Trump does end up cracking double digits, that will be very good for his performance. And now moving on to the state of Virginia. Keep in mind, this is a state that President Biden won back in the 2020 election by roughly 10 percentage points, so he did barely crack double digits. And as of today, April polling averages suggest Biden's up in the state by only 5.5 percentage points, so he actually loses 5% from his 2020 margin. And then Biden actually performs better among betting markets by 8.5 percentage points. And then expert ratings, he actually does crack double digits, similar to his 2020 margin of 10 percentage points. So it kind of varies on what you're actually taking a look at. For example, specifically polling averages alone, he's up by 5.5 percentage points, so it's much, much closer. But then when you take a look at expert ratings, Biden expands his lead significantly, which when you factor in all those things, all those three things, projected margin is 9.5 percentage points roughly. But at the end of the day, this video is only focusing on polling averages. Out of April, the latest and newest polls suggest that Biden wins Virginia by a lean margin. Even though he is going to win it, you see Glenn Youngkin, the governor there, actually endorsed Donald Trump, and he's currently, I believe, at a 58% approval rating. Tell me if I'm wrong, which is very good. So considering that could affect the race of Virginia in favor of Donald Trump, but it's still, at the end of the day, not going to be enough to actually flip this state. And then obviously you have Kennedy, so we'll see how that goes, whether it benefits Trump or Biden. So now, moving on to the state of Minnesota. Biden won this state by 7 percentage points back in 2020, and a lot of that had to do with BLM. He had that momentum in Minneapolis, and even after 2020, this state has shifted in favor of Democrats. Basically, the suburbs in this state has trended towards the left. Biden is actually performing well among white suburban women. And then you factor in issues like abortion, that can go in favor of Democrats and get them on the ballot. Polling averages has Biden up by almost 5 percentage points, which is not the greatest margin. I mean, it's still more than Hillary Clinton, but it's still less than his 2020 margin. So that's going to be lean. And then betting markets, he expands his lead to 8%, and then expert ratings has him up by 7%. But at the end of the day, polling averages says he's up by 5 percentage points, which is going to be considered a lean margin. Obviously, he's not going to have that BLM momentum, so he's going to lose a lot of that support, and it will narrow and tight up the race. But still, no matter how close it gets, regardless of the margin, Biden should win this state. And then moving on to New Hampshire, in which President Biden won back in 2020 by a likely margin, roughly 7 percentage points. And at the end of the day, polling averages out of this month currently have him up by a little bit closer, 6%, but he's still actually winning this state by a lean margin. And when Donald Trump had his best case back in 2016, he flipped all the 3 Rust Belt states, the most important ones, and he still could not flip a state like New Hampshire. He fell short. So with that being said, I think obviously Trump could perform as good as he did in 2016 in this year's election cycle, but it's still, I'm not quite sure if it's going to be enough. In a state like New Hampshire, I think Biden is going to win that by a lean margin. Now, moving on to the deep southern state of Georgia, in which President Biden won by less than a percentage point, 0.3% to be exact, in the 2020 election. A lot of that had to do with the African American turnout. He got high turnout among that minority group, nearly 90%, in which I do not expect him to get that performance. I think he can drop as low as 80%. Maybe if Trump is lucky enough, Biden drops to as low as 70% among African American registered voters. And Trump is actually polling around 25%, which is a fourth among that group, which is actually amazing for any Republican nowadays. It's not common to see, a Republican have so much support among, that type of group. But at the end of the day, current polling averages suggest that Donald Trump is expected to win the state by almost 4 percentage points, which is obviously less than his 2016 margin, but it's still going to be a flip in favor of Donald Trump. That's going to be a lean margin. Expert ratings has it, basically a tie, and then betting markets has Trump winning it by 2%. So at the end of the day, the projected margin comes out that Donald Trump is expected to flip Georgia. And I think it's going to be one of the easier flips for him. I mean, it's obviously easier to flip than a state like Arizona or Wisconsin, Michigan, or Pennsylvania even. So at the end of the day, Trump wins Georgia by a lean margin. And if a lot of those African-American voters that voted for Biden back in 2020, turn away from him and they don't turn out and they stay home, they don't have to vote for Trump. All they can do is just not vote for Biden, and that already is enough to actually flip the state, because Biden's margin was just so small. It was roughly only 10,000 votes. So this is very flippable for Donald Trump, and he's more than likely to flip the state. It's basically guaranteed in 2024. Now, the margin could get close. How close it gets, it doesn't really matter. Trump should win Georgia in the 2024 election. And a lot of them actually only voted for Biden was because he picked Kamala Harris as his VP, and she's one of the most disapproved of vice presidents of all time. So that already does not help, and it's more than likely flipping to Donald Trump. And then moving on to the state of North Carolina. North Carolina is a state that Democrats and Biden hoped that he would flip in the 2020 election. They betted hard, they campaigned hard, they flooded the state with ads, and they still fell short. 2020 was way more favorable for Joe Biden. He had like 10% more better approval rating than where he is today. Now he was seen more as a moderate candidate, and if he still fell short in more of a favorable year, 2024 obviously is less favorable. So you really think he's going to do better in North Carolina now or possibly flip it? No. Trump is going to expand his lead in North Carolina from his 2020 margin, similar to 2016. But current polling averages suggest that Trump is in very good shape in this state. He's winning it by 5%, which is more than his 2016 margin. Betting markets is a little bit closer, but Trump still wins by 3%. Expert ratings, he's up by 3%. So overall, statewide, Trump is going to do very well, perform very well in North Carolina with its 16 electoral votes. He's going to win that by a lean margin. And now, before we end out the video, one last thing is we're going to be moving on to the 3 most important Rust Belt states that's going to decide the election, because obviously neither Trump or Biden is currently at 270 electoral votes yet. So moving on to the Rust Belt state of Wisconsin. The newest and latest polls out of this month, April, polling averages suggest that Trump is up by 1.7%, which is going to be considered a tilt margin in this state. Or actually, I think a lean margin. I think anything under a percentage point is a tilt margin. So obviously 1.7 is over 1%. So it's going to be a lean margin. Betting markets actually has Biden winning this state by a point, and then expert ratings has it a dead toss-up, 50-50 for either candidate. Now, Democrats, their strongholds are basically in Milwaukee, and then Trump obviously would perform very well in Green Bay. So honestly, it really comes down to those 20,000 voters that voted for Biden. If Trump can flip a lot of those, at least 20,000 votes. If Trump flips 20,000, then the state goes red, obviously. Now, keep in mind, Trump won the state by a greater margin than Biden did in 2020. Trump won the state by 0.8%. When Biden won, he only won it by 0.6, so considering that Trump did 0.2 better, goes to show you that Wisconsin will probably favor Trump in 2024, and I honestly think he flips the state, and that's exactly what the polls are suggesting, in which Trump wins the state by actually tilt to lean margin. Arguably, I'm going to say it's going to be a lean margin. Anything under a percent is going to be tilt. Obviously, he's up by 1.7 as of today. And now, moving on to the second Rust Belt state of Michigan, which is going to be very interesting because you have a large Arab population, more than any other state, and you see what's going on with Israel and Hamas. Voters are not pleased with the Biden administration, and considering that 100,000 people voted uncommitted in the Democratic primaries, I mean, is fascinating, because you may make the case that still 19,000 people voted uncommitted in 2020, so what's the difference? Well, 80,000 people more did it this time around, so that's a big difference. And, when you factor, I mean, that alone will not flip the state, obviously, but when you factor in undecided voters going in favor of Donald Trump, when you factor in RFK Jr., helping Trump, then yes, that's when the state will actually flip, because Biden won the state by over 200,000 votes. So it's going to take a lot for Trump to win the state. But at the end of the day, polling averages has Donald Trump up in the state by roughly 3 percentage points, which is better than his 2016 margin of under a percentage point. And then betting markets actually has Biden up by 1.7%. So if you take a look at that alone, that's probably good news for the Biden campaign. And then expert ratings has it basically Biden's up by 1 percentage point. And then Biden won the state by almost 3% back in 2020. So at the end of the day, this race is going to be close no matter what. Whether Biden wins, I won't be surprised, because I think he won by a good margin in 2020. So it's going to take a lot for Trump to actually overcome in order to flip the state. And then whether Biden wins or Trump wins, it doesn't really matter. It's going to be decided by under a percentage point. That's how close I think the state can get. But at the end of the day, all this video comes down to is polling averages, and Trump's up in the state by a lean margin. But it's kind of weird, because polls suggest that Trump does better in Michigan than he does in Wisconsin. That's typically not what you see in elections past. In previous elections, you would see that Wisconsin would vote to the right of Michigan, but that's not what the polls are suggesting. So I'm not sure if this would be accurate, but we would see. It all comes down to what happens on election day. And now the last and final state, actually we have two more, Arizona and Pennsylvania. Let's start with Arizona. The Sunbelt state of Arizona, which actually I believe handed over Biden victory, surpassing 270 electoral votes back in 2020. Current polling averages has Trump performing very well in this state, similar to his 2016 numbers of 3 percentage points. Betting markets actually has Biden up by 1%. Expert ratings has it a dead tie, 50-50 toss-up for either candidate. Trump is going to have to perform very well in Maricopa County. This is the county that Biden won by 2%, I believe, last time. And basically, whatever happens in Maricopa decides who wins this state entirely as a whole. Now, this state generally is actually shifting to the left very fast. It's not a slow shift. This is happening very quickly. I mean, you take a look at the 2022 midterms, they elected Democratic governor, which they have not done so since, I believe, 2009. So you can see the shifts. And on the Senate level, it's actually a lot bluer than on the governor's race. And I mean, if you take a look at McCain's margin of 11%, it dropped down to 7% for Mitt Romney, and then Trump in 3% for 2016, and then finally flipped to Biden in 2020. And you can see that each election cycle, it goes 3 to 4% to the left. That's the trend, and it's very consistent. So with that theory alone, Biden wins the state by roughly 3% in 2020. But considering that he is way more disapproved of, way more unpopular, and basically, if Donald Trump wins over the undecided voters, and if Donald Trump would have benefited from Kennedy, I will tell you right now, Trump is going to win Arizona, and that's exactly what the polls are suggesting. And if Trump is able to perform very well among the John McCain, the Mitt Romneys of Arizona, the John McCain-style voters in this state, which actually make up a big majority of Arizona's Republican Party, then Trump could very well win the state. And actually, a lot of the John McCain-style voters did not turn out for Trump in 2020, and actually, they might have actually voted for Biden. And basically, the neocons of Arizona is what I'm trying to say. If Trump does well with the neocons, if he, selects more of a traditional style, old school Republican as his vice president, similar to Pence in 2016, then yes, Trump would perform very well in the state. But as of today, he's winning it by a lean margin. And the last and final state, with its 19 electoral votes to cover for this video, is going to be the Rust Belt state of Pennsylvania, in which I think Biden probably has the best shot in Pennsylvania than any other Rust Belt state. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, I think Biden's best hope is probably Pennsylvania. It's his obviously home state besides Delaware. And this is a state where he's not facing the greatest outlash. Obviously, Wisconsin is a state that is shifting towards the right. And then in Michigan, you see what's happening with the Arab voters that are not pleased. 100,000 people voted uncommitted. And in Pennsylvania, you don't really see outlash against Biden. There's nothing really bad going for him. I mean, you could argue the economy, but that's not really, you can argue the economy, but that's not really unrest for something like what's happening in Gaza. As of today, polling average suggests Trump wins the state by 1%, which is not the greatest margin, but it's still good for any Republican winning a state like Pennsylvania, which is part of the blue wall that Trump broke in 2016 against Clinton. So betting markets actually has Biden winning by 2%, which is a great improvement for him. Expert ratings has him up by 0.7%, which the projected margin, when you factor in those three things, Biden's wins the state by 1%. And then basically Erie County, located in northwestern Pennsylvania, was a Trump county in 2016, and it went to Biden in 2020. So basically, whatever happens in that county will probably decide the state. I think that county, similar to Maricopa in Arizona, is very, very important, and it's telling on who's actually going to win the state. And if Biden is able to overperform on what the polls are saying in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia suburbs, that type of area, usually Democratic strongholds, then I think Biden can actually win this state. But this video is based off of polling averages, the latest and newest polls out of this month, April alone. So with that being said, Trump wins Pennsylvania by a total margin, but it's still going to be closer than the other two Rust Belt states, Wisconsin and Michigan, because obviously I think Biden would perform the best in Pennsylvania out of the other two states. So at the end of the day, Trump wins with 312 electoral votes, greater than his 2016 margin. For a non-incumbent, that's amazing. And then 226 for Joe Biden, which I believe would be his floor. And obviously RFK getting 0 electoral votes. So let me know your overall thoughts in the comment section down below. What states you agree with, what states you disagree with. Keep in mind, this is not my actual prediction. This is what the polling averages say out of this month. So, but one last final reminder before I end out the video is we do have memberships. So that's pinned in the comment section down below. We have custom perks and custom emojis that you can use whenever you comment on any of my videos. And also to subscribe and click the bell so you get notified whenever I upload a video instead of missing out on any of them. Thank you everyone for watching. We are nearing 2,000 subscribers.